Our first panel in the conference features two guest speakers. The theme is Jewish hospitality, and the speakers are Dr. Ed Kaplan from Brandeis and Dr. Jacob Meskin from the Hebrew College here in Boston. The session will be chaired by my colleague in the philosophy department, Jim Bernard, who is also director here of the Center for Jewish Christian Learning. This conference, I should just mention at the beginning, is part of a larger guest book project entitled Hosting the Stranger, and it consists of several other events in addition to this conference. These include an interdisciplinary seminar held weekly here at Boston College and jointly chaired by MIT. An international poetry festival comprising 9 poets that will be held here in late April. A second conference to be held on May 2nd here, entitled Philosophies of the Stranger. A series of international art exhibitions, 2 interactive websites that archive and record the ongoing events. And then finally, well not finally, sixthly, a DVD documentary which will be directed, produced, recorded over the next 5 years as the project develops. And as it follows a series of international performances of guest book that will be held in different centers of the wisdom traditions. The first of these will actually be performed this evening in St. Mary's Chapel. And this takes the form largely of a sung performance, songs of hospitality, in the Celtic Christian tradition. It will be performed by the famous Irish singer and composer Noreen Meereen, and he will be accompanied by Owen and Micheál Sulawan. And then the other international performances will, as it were, take the guest box and the guest book from Boston College to different venues of different wisdom traditions. So it will be Ireland, Nepal, India, Israel, and Cairo. I'd like briefly to thank our sponsors, in particular the Institute for Liberal Arts that's just been set up here in Boston College, and that is directed by David Quigley, who will be dropping in later, who is also our current dean, so he's wearing 2 hats, and I'd very much like to thank him for all his support from the beginning. The Jesuit Institute, that is co-sponsoring both the concert and the conference, and the Journal of Religion and the Arts. Finally, in keeping with the multimedia character and experimental character of the guest book project, we're going to begin this conference, as we begin, we have been beginning each of our seminars with an audiovisual component. These video collages are produced by the students who are participating in the seminar, several of whom are here today. And this one is called Songs of Sacred Eros, featuring images and verses of love and hospitality from the 5 wisdom traditions. And as you may know, certainly the people in the seminar here, the wager of the entire project is about the common roots of the 2 terms hostility and hospitality. In Indo-European, it's hostis, which can mean either enemy or guest. And so there's a wager in this. It's not hospitality as cheap grace or an easy abstract virtue, but an actual adventure, risk, wager as to how hospitality can be wrestled from hostility. And both this conferences and the other events that I've mentioned are about this particular drama, which in short is the drama of war and peace. So we'll have our 2 speakers now. Just after the video collage, Jim Bernard will introduce our 2 speakers, and then we will have hopefully 30-40 minutes for question and answer.
It gaudium anime Shir Hashirim Asher Lishlomo. Oh, that you would kiss me with the kisses of your mouth. Draw me after you, let us make haste. The king has brought me into his chambers. I am dark, but I am beautiful.
You have ravished my heart, my sister, my bride. You have ravished my heart with a glance of your eyes. How much better is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your oils than any spice. Your lips distill nectar, my bride. Honey and milk are under your tongue. The scent of your garments is like the scent of Lebanon. A garden locked is my sister, my bride. A garden locked, a fountain sealed, a garden fountain, a well of living water and flowing streams from Lebanon.
I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine. He pastures his flock among the lilies. As an apple tree among the trees of the wood, so is my beloved, and his fruit was sweet to taste. Refresh me with apples, for I am sick with love.
Under the apple tree I awakened you. There your mother was in travail with you. There she who bore you was in travail. Set me as a seal upon your heart, for love is as strong as death. Its flashes are flashes of fire, a flame of Yahweh himself. John of the Cross. Entrado sea la esposa en el ameno huerto deseado, y a su sabor reposa el cuello reclinado sobre los dulces brazos del amado.
Clare of Assisi. Draw me after you, heavenly spouse. We shall run in the fragrance of your perfumes. I shall run and not grow weary until you bring me into the wine cellar, until your left hand is under my head and your right arm blissfully embraces me, and you kiss me with the most blissful kisses of your mouth.
John of the Cross. In the inner wine cellar I drank of my beloved. The bride has entered the sweet garden of her desire, and she rests in the light, laying her neck on the gentle arms of her beloved.
Hildegard of Bingen. O viridissima Virga. O most greening branch, hail, hail, because the heat of the sun exudes from you like the perfumes of balm. The beautiful flower came forth from you, which gave all aridness their aromas. Then the skies rained down dew on the fields, and all the earth rejoiced, because the warmth of the sun exudes from you like the perfumes of balm. The beautiful flower blossomed from you. Then, O sweet virgin, you know only pure joy. The birds in the windy air build their nests in your hair. Eve turned her back on all of this, but now let there be praise to the highest.
John of the Cross. Beneath the apple tree, there I took you for my own. There I offered you my hand and restored you.
Teresa of Avila. It pleased the Lord that I should see an angel, very beautiful, his face so aflame. In his hands I saw a long golden spear, and at the end of the iron tip I seemed to see a point of fire. With this he seemed to pierce my heart several times, so that it penetrated to my womb. When he drew the spear out, I thought he was drawing my womb out with it, and he left me completely afire, with great love. The pain was so sharp that it made me utter several moans, and so excessive was the sweetness caused me by this intense pain that one can never wish to lose it, nor will one's soul be content with anything less. Love comes with a knife, not some shy question and not with fears for its reputation. Think of the spiderweb, woven across the cave where Muhammad slept. There are love stories, and there is obliteration in love. I have no more words. Let the soul speak with the silent articulation of a face.
Did you hear that winter's over? The basil and the carnations cannot control their laughter. The trees reach out their congratulations. The soul goes dancing through the king's doorway. Lilacs blush because they have seen the rose naked. New creatures whirl in from non-existence. Galaxies scatter around their feet. Have you met them? A feast is set. Listen, the wind is flowing wine. Love used to hide inside images, no more. Nothing can stay bound or be imprisoned. You say, end this poem here and wait for what's next? I will. Poems are rough notations for the music we are.
Radha to Krishna. Krishna, come quickly to meet me. Death is better for me than living in my vacant body. Why do I endure love's devouring flame?
Krishna to Radha. Leave lotus footprints on my bed of tender shoots, Radha. Let my place be plundered by your tender feet. I stroke your foot with my lotus hand. You have come far. Set your golden anklet on my bed like the sun. Consent to my love. Let elixir flow from your face to end our separateness.
Radha to Krishna. My lord, your hand is cooler than sandbalm on my breast. Paint a leaf design with deer musk here on love's vessel. Lover, draw paint glossier than a swarm of black bees on my eyes. Kiss away the lamp-black bow that shoots arrows of love. My ears reflect the restless gleam of doe eyes, graceful lord. Hang earrings to form snares for love. Make a mark with liquid deer musk on my moonlit brow. Make a moon shadow, Krishna. Fix flowers in shining hair loosened by love play. Paint a leaf on my breasts. Lay a girdle on my hips. Twine my heavy braid with flowers. Samsara and Nirvana are the tambour and the drum. Mind and breath are the flute and the cymbal. The sound of the kettle drum rises in the sky. Birth is consumed, and the highest dharma is dowry. Day and night pass in love play. In the troop of yoginis, night becomes dawn. Yogis find delight in the embrace of the Dombi, and do not leave her for a moment, being drunk with simultaneously arisen bliss.
In the sky above the sky, there is an overgrown garden. There is the spade of the heart. When at the neck the delightful girl awakens, it is unearthed. Abandon, oh abandon your old mother. In love play, the Savara has taken the beautiful maid. My overgrown garden yields the cotton of the sky, for now the white cotton flower has blossomed. By the side of the overgrown garden, the maize garden appears. Darkness dissolves, sky blossoms forth. The Savara and the Savari drink deep. Every day the Savara perceives nothing, being giddy with love play. In 10 directions, the Savara obtains nirvana.
At midnight, the lotus is in full bloom, lit by the rays of the Vajra. The 32 yogis delight their limbs in the place of great bliss. The moon is driven to the Vajra summit. The jewel speaks of simultaneously arisen bliss. The moon drifts to the light of nirvana. The lotus is carried to the lotus pool. Bliss of cessation is purified at the moment called without things. Whoever understands this is a Buddha.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Richard for inviting me to be at this session today. Privilege. It strikes me there's a special sensitivity and wisdom in Jewish culture with regard to hospitality. and this for at least two reasons. It is, of course, the history of expulsions that the Jewish people have experienced over the centuries. They know what it means to be unwelcomed. And the second reason is that the fact that Jews have watched over the centuries how Christians have taken up residence in the house of Israel, and by taking over their scriptures, and sometimes in the process terribly distorting them. So I look forward to our discussion this afternoon. Our first speaker is Professor Edward Kaplan, who is the Kaiserman Professor of the Humanities and Chair of the Department of Romance Languages at Brandeis University. He's probably best known for his two-volume work on Abraham Joshua Heschel. The first volume was published in 1998, and it was co-authored with the late Samuel Dresner, and it was entitled Abraham Joshua Heschel, Prophetic Witness. The second volume appeared in 2007 and was entitled Spiritual Renewal, Abraham Joshua Heschel in America, 1940 to 1972. And that volume was recently awarded the National Jewish Book Award in American Jewish Studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Edward Kaplan.
Thank you very much for your generous welcome. After this video, it's a bit difficult to go from the ecstasy of love to the uncertainties of hospitality, but nevertheless, this is the world in which we live. To welcome guests, we need to have a home. One way to examine the Jewish tradition of hospitality is to view it as part and parcel of the Jewish condition, which has been one of homelessness, instability, even exile, at least until the recent establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. From the expulsion of humankind's mythic ancestors from the Garden of Eden, through the enslavement of the ancient Israelites in Egypt, the Babylonian exile, and the second destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in year 70 of the Common Era, Jews have yearned for a homeland. My reflections today, however, are not primarily historical or ideological, but hopefully spiritual. Spiritual is rooted in historical and daily realities. Jewish tradition has canonized at least three major affirmations of hospitality toward the stranger. First, the biblical paradigm of hospitality in the book of Genesis. It's the story of Abraham and his wife Sarah, the original patriarch and matriarch of the Jewish people. And I shall begin with that text. The opening is intriguingly elliptical, and I'm quoting from a translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the terebinths of Mamre. He was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Looking up, he saw three men standing near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing to the ground, he said, "My lords, if it please you, do not go on past your servant. Let a little water be brought, bathe your feet, and recline under the tree." Abraham's response is characterized by extraordinary zeal. He ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them. Bowing to the ground, he treated his guests with utmost respect, even with reverence. And there's some ambiguity, of course, as to whether these three strangers are human beings, simple human beings, or angels, or some way convey in a more mysterious form the divine presence. Abraham then prepared the next stage of hospitality, food, and again on the run, I quote, Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, 3 seahs of choice flour and make cakes." Then Abraham ran to the herd, took a calf, tender and choice, and gave it to a servant boy, who hastened to prepare it. He took curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. And Abraham waited on the guests under the tree as they ate. The three men enjoy a special meal, a feast. They reward Abraham and Sarah's hospitality by announcing that Sarah, already 90 years old and well past menopause, would become pregnant with a son, thus fulfilling God's promise to Abraham to be the father of a numerous nation. So who are these strangers, these wanderers? The lack of transition from line 1, the Lord appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre, with the ambiguous definition of the three strangers as men, suggests that these are angels before God, or angels from God, excuse me. And yet the text repeatedly states that Abraham had welcomed and recognized ordinary human beings. Here the status of stranger is imbued with sacred mystery. Their story is the biblical paradigm of hospitality. Some commentators have emphasized Abraham and Sarah's extraordinary hospitality even beyond what is indicated in the biblical text, claiming that their tent was open to 4 sides to welcome wayfarers. The next episode in Genesis confirms Abraham's status as a moral example. God tells Abraham that God will destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for their sins. And Abraham has the nerve to challenge God, arguing and finally convincing God to save the cities of the plain, if 10 righteous persons could be found. So God changed the divine mind. Biblical paradigm number 2. We fast forward to the book of Exodus and the captivity of the Israelites in Egypt. Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac had continued his parents' covenant with God. By the end of Genesis, Isaac's son Joseph had successfully saved Egypt from famine. But after Joseph's death, quote, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. According to the famous phrase, the Israelites were, quote, strangers in a strange land, slaves and aliens. The story of Moses and the liberation of the Israelites from Egypt begins. The Passover festivity, which we're already anticipating in our community, commemorates the second biblical model of Jewish hospitality. The ceremonial dinner, the Seder, the highly symbolic as well as tasty Passover meal, is probably the most observed by Jews around the world, and Christians too, especially if we include the Last Supper of Jesus and his disciples and its reenactment in the Eucharist. For Jewish families, the Seder is a pedagogical tool as well as a holy celebration. At the beginning, well before the actual meal, a child asks the 4 questions, the first of which is, why is this night different from all other nights? The answer begins, because we were slaves unto Pharaoh in Egypt, and the eternal, our God, brought us forth from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. It is an obligation for all Jews to pass on this story from generation to generation. The Passover story is an essential part of Jewish identity as it nurtures a sense of social responsibility, of which hospitality to the stranger is a keynote. to remember that we were once strangers in a strange land, not only constitutes an act of solidarity with Jews around the world, it also and especially establishes solidarity with all oppressed people. Even secularized Jews celebrate the Passover as a call to universal responsibility. So the liberation of Exodus is not the end point. One major lesson for us, as for the ancient Israelites, is the significance of 40 years of wandering in the desert before entering the promised land. During those 40 years, the people Israel struggled with God and God's commandments. Numerous times, such as the incident of the golden calf, God had to punish the Israelites to remind them of their subordination to God's values. In fact, it is the desert itself that Moses commands the Israelites to celebrate. It's in the desert itself that Moses commands the Israelites to celebrate the Passover, and I'm quoting here. "Throughout the ages, you shall celebrate it as an institution for all time. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel," cut off from the Israelites. The integrity of the Jewish house becomes a precondition for hospitality. Later in the same discourse, Moses repeats, with a significant addition, the basic rule of what we call now kosher for Passover. And I'm quoting, "No leaven shall be found in your house for 7 days, for whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the community of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a citizen of the country." A new category of human social being has been established. In Hebrew, it's called the ger, or stranger, or resident alien. The ger who dwells among or even with the Israelites. The ger is subject to the same regulations, privileges, and prohibitions, or almost the same. Only the Israelites, however, are required to eat matzah. Matzah is the unleavened bread. Further distinctions apply to the ger, or the stranger. I'm quoting, "If a stranger who dwells with you would offer the Passover to the Lord, all his males must be circumcised. Then shall he be admitted to offer it. He shall then be as a citizen of the country, but no uncircumcised person may eat of it. There shall be one law for the citizen and for the stranger who dwells among you." So we've entered into a very complicated area, which I am not going to discuss in detail. But the essence of it is that fundamentally, although there are differences in required observance, ritual observance, there is a fundamental equality within Israelite society between the Israelite and the stranger, or resident stranger. The stranger receives even more attention later on in the book of Leviticus, as God establishes laws of justice in the city. The order and context of this passage are essential. Notice how God reasserts divine authority as a foundation of human social values, and here I'm quoting. "You shall rise before the aged and show deference to the old. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord." So Leviticus is where all the rules are formulated. And here, notice that after each ethical demand, God reasserts the divine sovereignty. So it's ethics, I'm anticipating on my conclusion, but why not? Ethics is inseparable from the spiritual commitment to God. So you shall rise before the aged and show deference to the old. You shall fear your God. And fear here is reverence, fear and trembling. When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. You shall love him as yourself. Okay? So not just law, but love. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And I'm continuing with the quotation. And you shall not falsify measures of length, weight, or capacity. You shall have an honest balance, honest weights. I, the Lord, am your God, who freed you from the land of Egypt. You shall faithfully observe all my laws and all my rules. I am the Lord. Very great demands. God cares about the details. Every act of dishonesty is a major crime. In addition, this is a universal morality. The stranger must be treated with as much deference as any other citizen. The converse is also true, I'm quoting. Anyone among the Israelites or among the strangers residing in Israel who gives any of his offspring to Moloch shall be put to death. The Jewish festival of Sukkot marks the third and most explicit reference point for Jewish hospitality. Apart from the Passover Seder, to which many non-Jews are invited, Sukkot, the harvest festival of booths, provides a systematic space for hospitality, which has become an actual divine commandment, or a mitzvah. A mitzvah is actually a commandment from God signifying God's will. In colloquial terms, it means a good deed, but it's a lot more than that, a mitzvah. We are enjoined to construct an impermanent room-like booth whose roof is covered with greens but open to the sky, often subjected to the cold and rain. Traditional Jews strive to obey the commandment to sleep in the sukkah for 7 nights. At the very least, we are commanded to invite guests for dinner. It is an obligation of Jewish law. There is a commandment, mitzvah, to eat in the sukkah and a mitzvah to welcome guests. It is true that most culturally assimilated Jews do not actually build a sukkah. But all synagogues have a sukkah for their members, and the commandment to welcome guests for a festive meal is widely practiced in our synagogues and in our homes. Guests are welcomed in such a way as to canonize the mitzvah of hospitality. That is, hospitality as a response to God's will. Upon entering the sukkah, the booth, special prayers are said to welcome the guests, who are called ushpizin in Hebrew. I read the English translation of the first Hebrew prayer, and it's a bit of an archaic translation, but I think it actually conveys the positively archaic nature of the ritual. Enter, exalted holy guests. Enter, exalted holy patriarchs, to be seated in the shade of exalted faithfulness, in the shade of the Holy One. Enter, Abraham the beloved one, Moses the faithful shepherd, Aaron the holy priest, Joseph the righteous one, and David the anointed king. In Sukkot you shall dwell. Be seated, exalted guests, be seated. Guests of faithfulness, be seated. These are no ordinary guests, of course, but the 7 patriarchs of the Jewish people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, Joseph, and David. The Jewish mystical tradition in the Zohar explains that when guests enter the sukkah in faithfulness, the wings of God's presence, the Shekhinah, are spread over them. Without entering into more details of this complicated Kabbalistic tradition, one more interpretation fills out the sacred significance of this act of hospitality. The order of the guests, of the Ushpizim, is like a summary of God's attributes or emanations as evoked in the Zohar. The Zohar is the basic text of Jewish mystical tradition, and here I'm quoting. Abraham is loving kindness or chesed. Isaac, power or gevurah. Jacob, splendor or tiferet. I'm just giving the English and the Hebrew. Moses is eternality or netzach. Aaron is glory or chod. Joseph is foundation or yesod, and David is kingship or malchut. Okay, so these are ways of conceptualizing different dimensions of the transcendent God, but the living God. Such is the spiritual significance of hospitality. The mystical Zohar becomes concrete as it embodies God's emanations in the patriarchs of the Jewish people. And yet, are not all finite human beings an image of God, according to the story in Genesis. And every human being a messenger from God. That is why Abraham and Sarah keep their tent open on all four sides. A radically open tent. Metaphorically, we must keep our hearts open. In the Jewish world, after the Bible and after the Talmudic discussions, religious law, which is called halakha, has encoded these rituals in a general principle of hospitality called hanasat orchim, which is a serious legal obligation to welcome the stranger. We have thus traversed the books of Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus, from the spiritual to the ethical, which were indeed never separated. Finally, I want to share with you a more metaphorical approach, but no less concrete, an approach to the ideal of hospitality, one which is perhaps even more universal than the open tent or the sukkah. I'm speaking about Abraham Joshua Heschel's understanding of prayer. Rabbi Heschel was a direct descendant of the founders of Hasidism, the 18th century pietistic movement that began in Poland, whose main purpose was to bring all Jews closer to the living God through prayer and celebration. Rabbi Heschel spoke these eloquent words about prayer at a Christian conference on liturgy held in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1969. The metaphor of home represents the enveloping power of prayer to welcome seekers of God and of spiritual integrity. Here, God is the host, and we are the guests. Prayer can become our spiritual dwelling place. And here I'm quoting from Rabbi Heschel. All things have a home. The bird has a nest, the fox has a hole, the bee has a hive. A soul without prayer is a soul without a home. Weary, sobbing, the soul, after roaming through a world festered with aimlessness, falsehoods, and absurdities, the soul seeks a moment in which to gather up its scattered life, in which to divest itself of enforced pretensions and camouflage, in which to simplify complexities, in which to call for help without being a coward. Such a home is prayer. Continuity, permanence, intimacy, authenticity, earnestness are its attributes. For the soul, home is where prayer is. Yes, we are in exile in the world, Heschel suggests. One task of religion is to transform exile into a pilgrimage, a lonely journey into a goal. For God's hospitality is infinite, always available to the pilgrim, to the stranger. I'm continuing with Heschel. What is a soul without prayer? A soul runaway, or a soul evicted from its own home. To those who have abandoned their home, the road may be hard and dark and far, yet do not be afraid to steer back. If you prize grace and eternal meaning, you will discover them upon arrival. Now, Heschel goes on to evoke the transformative power of hospitality for the stranger. And are we not, all of us, resident aliens? The guest is indeed liberated, and I finish with this quotation from Heschel. How marvelous is my home! I enter as a suppliant and emerge as a witness. I enter as a stranger and emerge as next of kin. I enter spiritually shapeless, inwardly disfigured, and emerge wholly changed. It is in moments of prayer that my image is forged, that my striving is fashioned. To understand the world, I must love my home. It is difficult to perceive luminosity anywhere if there is no light in my own home. It is in light of prayer's radiance that I find my way even in the dark. Thank you for this opportunity to join our Jewish journeys to yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaplan. You reminded me, you recall from me my first experience in a sukkah, which was here in Newton this past fall, and what a wonderful and moving experience that was. Our second speaker is Jacob Meskin, who is the academic director of the Mayhap program and assistant professor of Jewish thought and education at Hebrew College in Newton. Dr. Meskin received his doctorate from the Department of Religion at Princeton University and publishes on various topics in philosophy, religion, and modern Jewish thought. His articles have appeared in such publications as Modern Judaism, the Journal of Religion, Cross Currents, Judaism Soundings, and Levinas Studies, as well as in several edited volumes. Currently, he's working on a manuscript on the role of Jewish tradition in the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas.
Thank you very much. So I suppose the first thing I should say before I launch into it is my talk has all the advantages of theft over honest toil. Ed has done all the work and laid out the actual rudiments, the actual structure of hospitality in the Jewish tradition, which frees me to play. So I guess I'm going to owe Ed a lot of money or something. Thank you, Ed. And did a great job. We actually coordinated a bit. So I'm going to try to ask a different sort of question. The other thing I should say is that at least I would begin with questions of sort of philosophical nature. Those of you who are familiar with literature, you'll be fine. Those of you who, when you hear the word philosophy, immediately want to leave the room, I will try to be as clear as I possibly can so that the ideas come across. And just sort of in terms of the itinerary, I want to ask both a philosophical and a Jewish question about hospitality. And I want to move through that question, talk some things about Jewish history, and end with just some discussion of a Jewish practice of hospitality, a particular one that Ed once again set the stage for. So that's kind of the agenda here. Every religious tradition has something valuable to say about hospitality and many other things. But each tradition also has its own background experience, its own particular development in history, through which that tradition and its people passed, its own tensions, movements, texts. We need to be careful not to neglect this constitutive and generative background, and of course, all the human beings, their efforts, their experiences that went into it. For it is just this background, after all, from which insights into any given area of human life actually arise. This is important to bear in mind as we approach any religious tradition, but perhaps especially the Jewish tradition, especially when we approach it in order to learn what it may have to teach us about hospitality.
Slow down, please.
I am from New York City, I do apologize. I will try, it's going to get thicker, so good advice, thank you. I will try, stop me again. Okay, now this is not merely a worry about overgeneralizing or being too abstract. It's also a worry about another worry. Namely, it's a worry about Derrida's own founding worry, which has helped, in fact, to launch much contemporary academic concern with hospitality. I want to talk first about Derrida's worry, and then explain how it bears on Judaism and the Jewish tradition. So let me begin with the worry. What was Derrida's founding worry? Derrida introduces us to this worry by exploring the simultaneous possibility and impossibility of hospitality, the self-possession and dispossession that are needed all at once to be hospitable. Hospitality, after all, requires a home and a host in the home. And yet at the same time, hospitality also requires opening up and perhaps even giving up the home. And thus also for the host to abandon his or her status of being a host for the sake of the guest, the sake of the other, the stranger. Indeed, Derrida goes so far as to say that hospitality implies that the guest becomes the host and the host becomes the guest. By holding on both to the possibility and impossibility of hospitality, Derrida articulates his central worry, namely, that all of the various types of home and the processes through which we make them must all end up creating a distinct, bounded community, one which inevitably includes some folks, but excludes other folks. This is, of course, connected with Derrida's well-known meditations on the politics of friendship. After all, one can forge a friendship with anyone. Yet all friendships, even though they seem apparently unlimited and open, inevitably kind of close in and become fraternities or brotherhoods, a collective identity defined by specific traits which function to draw a boundary between us and them. Derrida worries about this us and them business, and sees deconstruction as an attempt to exert constant critical scrutiny and vigilance about these boundaries which we just sort of take for granted. Derrida says, don't take the boundaries for granted. We build them up by building up things like homes. That's why hospitality is so useful, even if it's also impossible. In all of this, Derrida says, he is, after all, working with the ideas of Emmanuel Levinas. For example, Levinas took the word subject and said that it meant to be subjected to the demands of the other. He takes the notion of a self to be a notion of indebtedness. My selfhood comes from the other. The core of my selfhood even arises as a substitution for the other. Yet, and this is the central point here, Derrida, in all his eloquent admiration for Levinas, also makes it clear that he's quite worried about Levinas's apparent lack of complete vigilance about what happens when you actually make a constituted community, an identity, a religious group, a state, and so on. All of these, of course, are us versus them. This is hardly to say that Levinas was an apologist or an advocate for any existing religious institution. On the contrary, Levinas always repeats that he is only a philosopher. I'm not sure if this is true, but he does repeat this all the time. He is a philosopher, and as such, he keeps his distance from apologetic claims that lack rigorous argument, and from what he calls the philosophically undeveloped views of average religious institutions. And yet, even so, Derrida worries that every time Levinas appropriates a Jewish text, or every time Levinas talks about Jewish identity, or even every time Levinas expresses a very highly qualified and ethically demanding form of Zionism, in all these cases, Derrida worries that in Levinas's thought, he has still failed to be vigilant enough. That is, Derrida worries that at times, Levinas comes too close to solidifying what are really permeable boundaries. Things like identity, community, and nation, which human beings build up. They're not given, we make them. And exactly this is the sort of way, Derrida worries, that exclusions, chauvinisms, and things like that get set up. Derrida's worry is a valid worry. It even has, among other things, a solid philosophical pedigree. After all, a lot of these ideas about worrying about having an identity and what you can do with it to exclude people come, after all, from Levinas's notion that once I'm ethically responsible for the other, I'm stuck. I am chosen before the other actually has chosen me, and I cannot discharge my infinite ethical responsibility for the other. I am never able for Levinas to get out of this. In other words, ethically for Levinas, you're always on the job. There's no vacation. And so we see here that one source for Derrida's invitation to be vigilant, even to be vigilant about Levinas, is Levinas. However, even admitting that Derrida's worry is valid, I am, in what is probably a classic Jewish fashion, still worried about it. I even go so far as to think you also should join me in being worried. In his zeal for being vigilant at the very second that any real community or real identity shows up, Derrida's worry perhaps forgets or loses sight of what has in this case made such a disposition to worry possible in the first place, namely a certain kind of experience of the Jews and of Judaism historically and religiously. Levinas in many ways and in many times admits that his philosophy owes a debt to this Jewish experience, especially as it's set out in and shaped by the text of the Jewish tradition. Thus Derrida too, in working with and transforming Levinasian notions in discussions of ideas like friendship, brotherhood, community, democracy, and hospitality, Derrida also stands in this line of debtors to the Jewish experience. For my money, Levinas constantly keeps his debts in view. I am not certain, however, that Derrida does. I think this leads Derrida to pay insufficient attention to the necessary factors that lie behind the phenomenon and the virtue of hospitality in the Jewish tradition. I want to discuss two of these factors that lie behind the Jewish notion of hospitality. Fortunately for me, Professor Kaplan has actually already done all the hard work, and he's already spoken eloquently about the first one of them. This is the overwhelming sense of obligation and responsibility that Jewish texts and practices evoke in their promulgation of the duty of showing hospitality. I would add to this only a point that Edith Wishegrod has made, namely that Judaism itself is an experience of the weight of the law. That is, it is an experience of the weight of obligation and responsibility. It is a surrounding ethos of ethical obligation. This is a factor in Levinas's and Derrida's philosophy. Most certainly it is clear in Derrida when he insists on the demanding and uprooting character of responsibility, even until the point of giving up your own home. Not many of us want to give up our own home. Derrida says to be hospitable implies the possibility of abandoning your home. That is one factor, the notion of obligation. But now I want to add another one. The other factor present in the Jewish conception of hospitality is the notion of a home, specifically the nature of a home in Judaism. The Jewish home, as has been well established, stands in for and is a substitution for the temple in Jerusalem, destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. The institution of Jewish law itself, whose commandments and rituals can be performed anywhere at any time, thus making Judaism a mobile religion, specifically reapplies the laws that were once germane to the temple to the Jewish home. Henceforth, the table in a Jewish home becomes the altar of the temple. The householders of a home become the Kohanim, or the high priests in the temple. In fact, the side of a Jewish home, which faces the east, which is the direction for many of us in which the temple once stood, is often marked with a special sign. And when building a new home, the classic code of Jewish law instructs faithful Jews to leave at least some small part of the house unfinished, to remind them that in their homes they must still mourn the loss of the temple and the unfinished character of the world until God will finally bring about the redemption. In a well-known article entitled Exile and Expulsion in Jewish History, the noted historian Yosef Yerushalmi explores the myriad of cultural and religious practices through which Jews managed to build up for themselves a sense of home and of being at home, even as they dwelt in various lands of exile. Once again, a process of analogy and moving patterns was invented and perfected, in which countries, regions, neighborhoods, streets all received specific ancient Hebrew names and designations reminiscent of Jerusalem and the ancient land of Israel. Yerushalmi terms this the dialectic of exile and domicile, the transformation of a powerless and exilic existence into one in which one could nonetheless achieve a state of being at home. Yerushalmi pays special attention to the case of Jews reflecting on having been expelled from one country and forced to relocate to another. In these cases, he notes wryly, the writings of Jewish intellectuals and poets reveals a formal longing for return to Jerusalem and the land of Israel, but a far more intense desire to return to the former country of residence. They say they want to go back to Jerusalem, but they're really thinking of France. This happens quite a bit, even though you have to read between the lines. I'm not sure what's happening now. It happened in the 1200s. It is through these sorts of creative religious and cultural practices that Jews came to have both real homes and, even more importantly, their unique religiously and socially constituted sense of a home. With this sort of background in place, the responsibility assigned to the virtue of hospitality in Judaism begins to take on its real weight. For that which one presides over, that is, one's own home, is also a microcosmic realization of the temporarily missing macrocosmic home of God, namely the temple. Even more powerfully, one's own home is also located in a land which itself has been rendered in some way akin to the ancient land, which is also temporarily missing. It is this home, located in this land, that one must open to the guest, the stranger, the wanderer. According to Jewish law, the value of hospitality is inestimably and immeasurably great. Perhaps among other reasons, this is because what one is opening up to the stranger in hospitality has been achieved only through so much personal, religious, and cultural work. Indeed, many scholars argue that in the Jewish tradition, the notion of prayer, the notion of ritual, is to construct a home for God in the world. People have gone so far as to say an individual person is supposed to be a kind of home or dwelling place for God on the earth. My worry then, to return to being worried, my worry then is simply that it is very easy to insist, perhaps rightly and importantly, on the endlessly oscillating dynamic of hospitality, in which there must be a home and there must be a giving up of the home, and to recommend vigilance. Ironically, though, and without in any way minimizing the amazing work of Derrida, it does still remain far, far easier to work out such philosophical formulations of hospitality than it is to create the homes that such formulations of hospitality assume. Vigilance, upon which all honor, nonetheless neither builds nor maintains a home, nor does it create and shape land on which the home rests. Perhaps then, sober consideration of the Jewish tradition, which itself inspired Derrida's own worry, allows us the perspective to add yet one more worry. One must have a home, and presumably all the many kinds of work homes require, in order to be hospitable. Here, community and identity may each be, as Derrida calls them, a pharmakon, that is, a remedy that may cure or kill. But perhaps you also have to be somewhere in order to have a discussion about this marvelous undecidable situation. Will endless invocations of undecidable situations themselves help to build up the somewhere you have to be in to have the discussions? I don't think so. Vigilance is not enough. Vigilance, I would say, must remain vigilant about what makes it possible in the first place. So that's my introduction of the vigilance issue. I want to conclude by talking about a specific Jewish religious practice of hospitality that actually bears on this issue. In the Jewish tradition, we're not necessarily told we always have to abandon our homes. We are told, however, that we have to accompany a guest when they leave. The term for this in Hebrew is levaya. Levaya is also the term for a funeral procession. So let's make sure that there's anybody in the audience who knows that I'm not talking about a funeral procession. That's an unhappy event, usually. Levaya simply means an accompaniment. So when you accompany a guest out of the home, according to the Jewish texts, you are fulfilling the commandment of hospitality. In fact, Maimonides goes so far as to say, if you have a guest over and you feed them and you're polite, but you simply let them leave without walking them a certain number of spaces from your home, you have failed to be a host. It's interesting. It could be because of the conditions of danger in those days. Some texts argue that the guest will feel lonely when they leave your home, and you're sort of precluding the loneliness by walking them a certain amount. Obviously, there's a space here to wonder, well, then if you walk them too far, do they have to walk you back because you'd be lonely? I'm not going to go there. It's obviously a sort of rabbinic matter. I just want to look at one brief mystical commentary on this issue. Again, it did all my work for me. So, in the Bible, in Genesis, when it talks about Abraham and the guests, once the guests have been fed, the guests, of course, are angels. The Bible says, this is Genesis chapter 18, verses 16 and 17, the men, the angels, rose up from thence and looked out towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. Abraham accompanies them to bring them on their way. At that very point, God says, shall I hide from Abraham that which I am doing, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, etc., etc. And as Ed said, this is the moment where God says to Abraham, I'm going to wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, you can't do this, you're the judge of the whole world, you wipe out the innocent with the guilty. And God says, I've decreed it this way. And Abraham says, what if I find you 50 righteous men? And God says, okay, if you find you 50, I'll spare it. And Abraham, no idiot, says, how about 45? And he goes on. Actually, it's 40. You'll have to read the text. It's well known. Anyway, in this situation, the mystical text, the Zohar, which I had mentioned, points out that there is a sort of juxtaposition of verses. When it says Abraham went with them to bring them on the way, the next verse is, and God says, shall I hide from Abraham that which I am doing? The mystical text of the Zohar, written in the 13th century Spain, makes the following comment. It is highly incumbent upon a man to escort a departing guest, for this is as it were the crown of the act of hospitality. So, while he was walking with them, the Holy One appeared to Abraham, as it is written, and the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that which I am doing? The terms used here for God imply that God was attended, in fact, by all the angels. Thus we see, when a man escorts his departing friend from the home, he draws the literal presence of God to join him and to accompany him on the way as a protection. Now, of course, Judaism is a religion of commentary. As I always tell my students, life is short and Judaism is long. So this, of course, this text cannot go uncommented. And in the 16th century, Rabbi Abraham Galante has his own comment on this Zohar comment on the Bible. That's the way it works. It's Russian vowels all the way down. He says, this juxtaposition of verses, where we first have Abraham accompanying the guests and then God speaking, clearly proves the greatness of the act of accompanying guests. I'm giving you a free translation. Because after all, we see here that as Abraham walked with the guests, he received a direct and personal revelation from God to him. And then Rabbi Abraham Galante, who's a mystic, says, this must teach us the greatness of this act of accompaniment, for after all, mystics know it is necessary to be in isolation and to prepare oneself so that one may unite with the divine mystical substance. Yet here Abraham, as he walks with fellow human beings, is united with God's presence without any preparation or isolation. So this is, from the mystical tradition, an amazing comment. As if to say, here the goal of all of our mystical way of life is effortlessly achieved by simply walking with your guests from your home. I end with this just to make some reflections. This is an interesting model. When you leave your home with a guest, you've left your home. You are momentarily kind of like a guest, or co-guests or something, wayfarers. Of course you're going to go back to your home. It's not high risk. It's a moderate transformation. Derrida is telling us there are times we must be so vigilant that we have to give up our home. There will be times. Derrida is a smart man. But when we're not in extreme situations, maybe this is a more reasonable attempt in a Judaic vein to think of hospitality. You do leave your home, but you can go back to it. It's not such a bad thing to have a home. Homes are good things. You shouldn't take them so lightly, perhaps. And one more thing, and then I will stop. I was thinking about this as I was coming over here, and it dawned on me, maybe this isn't a bad paradigm either, at least one of the many possible paradigms, for interreligious communication. Can I accompany my Hindu or Muslim guest away from my own home, along the path that leads back to his or her home? Can he or she accompany me? It's not perfect, but we might learn something about each other walking on the way. So I'm wondering if this model of Levaya can be the future seed of more philosophical speculation. Thank you.
I was just struck by, in listening to you, that Heschel, Derrida, and Levinas were all had the experience of being a stranger in a society in which they were not born. Now, how, in your
reading of them, does that experience of having been strangers combine with their biblical heritage in interpreting this hospitality?
Well, I think the paradigm of the exile from the Garden of Eden and the liberation from Egypt and the wandering in the desert for 40 years and then the expulsion from the Promised Land, that's the historical, you could call it the negative historical dimension of Jewish experience. So I think in spite of themselves, how secularized or not these three thinkers might be, they would, being in exile is part of the Jewish condition and part of Jewish identity. So it's really in Scripture as well as in modern history.
No, that's an excellent comment. I was just thinking one of the things that I think a French commentator wrote about Levinas was that Levinas exploits the full, this is an odd statement, the full power of the exilic experience in his writing. And I'm thinking the power of the exilic experience. Jews didn't have any power in the exile. And yet there is a molding of mind that it accomplishes. So perhaps that's a good comment.
Is this working okay? Okay, two quick questions, if I might. The first is for Ed, really, I think, around the festival of Sukkot that you mentioned, where one erects a symbolic or a literal tent and is reminded of one's nomadic tradition. And as I heard you, you seem to be saying the tent could serve one or other function, either a tent to receive strangers, or a tent where you, as a Jew, remind yourself that you're a stranger and that you were once a stranger. Now, following the second model, we're all kind of guests in the world. I mean, Jews and by extension everybody. And we're even guests in our own house. And that seemed to support the three examples you gave. Abraham is in a tent. The Passover is exilic. It's people on the move. And then finally, the Festival of Sukkot itself is a reminder of this pilgrimage, that we're pilgrims on the way. And then you ended with Heschel's notion that that prayer is home. And indeed, a divine home which hosts us and we're guests. So I'm just wondering, given that reading, how do we then find a place for the home where we host as humans? If the suggestion seems to be that we are properly guests on this earth, and the Sukkot reminds us of that, and that God is the true host, then how can we come back to a certain defense of the home, albeit a vigilant attitude to the home that Jacob was recommending? So that's my first question. My second is maybe more of a comment. What about the hard cases in Jewish scripture and in any scripture, I think, any religious scripture, where on the one hand you have hospitality, but on the other hand you seem to find examples of the very opposite. Abraham receives the strangers and Isaac is born, but then, Ishmael and Hagar are sent off into the desert. So an act of hospitality seems to be accompanied by an act of hostility. Secondly, just another quick example, in Judges, we dealt with this in a seminar on Wednesday, the good man who receives the Levite and his wife into his house, and he hosts them, but then when the Sodomites come, the Levite delivers his wife to be raped, and the host, the good man, delivers his daughter. So again, what does one do with these difficult cases? I mean, I think, as I say, the difficult cases in the Christian scriptures too. But what's going on there? Is it kind of a struggle within the texts to say, the human experience has hostility and hospitality, and we've got to try and choose one rather than the other? In other words, is it a hermeneutic question? It's up to us, for rabbinical Talmudic scholars to distinguish one from the other, or do we have to find a way of trying to justify what the Levite did to his wife and the good man did to his daughter?
Maybe I should just give this to Jacob. So the general, let me just answer the question, try to respond to the second question first, and if I remember, you can remind me to respond to the first question. I mean, I think the question that you ask is a question about the Bible, hermeneutics, because you're talking about interpreting a text. The behavior of the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible is sometimes sublime, particularly when God appears and communicates with the Israelites, and more often than not, horrifying or disappointing. Does that remind you of some aspect of universal human reality? So, to return to Heschel, he said that the Bible is not a human book about God, but is really God's perspective of humankind. And humankind is profoundly imperfect. So I think intuitively, I use the term paradigm in the ideal or idealized examples that I gave, because those are the standards of behavior that, let's say, Jewish tradition maps out for us. And even though in the Bible itself, certain behaviors may not be explicitly condemned, we as readers of the Bible, within the context of worship, if we, whatever tradition we are, but let's say as Jews, we read the Torah every Shabbat, and usually book selections also from the prophets. And so we are forced to confront behaviors that are repugnant to us as modern moral human beings. And we have examples of both those attitudes and perspectives within the Bible. So I think that the hermeneutical question, you have to look at what makes you look for a one standard example in the Bible, and not a multiplicity of good and evil, and on the continuum of good and evil of human behaviors in the Bible. In terms of host and guest, of course, the word hôte in French, if you want to take another Latinate language, can mean both host and guest. So I would rather kind of bow out of the deconstructionist pessimism that Jacob so eloquently represents, with a critical distance too, and say that let's have both in mind, but if we have the courage to put the emphasis on the positive. So I think that, yes, we need a home, but the home is never perfect.
I do, but you did a very good job. I was just going to...
Invite this guy home for dinner.
He does my work for me and he gives me dinner. It's good. So I have two responses. I wonder if... I am a philosopher, and I suppose I should join a group called Philosophers Anonymous and stand up and say that I confess I'm a philosopher. But having done that, let me try not to be a philosopher for a minute. There is a practical political side to the question about how one reads the Bible. I'm reminded about how the older commentators, as early as the Middle Ages, are clear in commenting on the episode where David makes sure that Uriah the Hittite, the wife of Bathsheba, gets sent away and murdered, and so he can, of course, enjoy Bathsheba. They are clear he is a sinful, evil man. He may repent. He may be a great king in many other ways, but this is a wrong. Perhaps it's a wrong which will teach him something. Maybe it's a wrong he should never have committed. Absolutely. Okay. By the time you get to the 20th century and you're packaging the product of a sort of Judaism cut off from all of the possibilities it contains, David was completely sinless. He could never have done anything wrong. We are clear that if this is in the Bible, there was a super purpose that God had in mind. If David hadn't committed these sins, everything would have gone wrong. It's funny, for 800 years he was a sinner. By the 20th century, he's a saint who never committed a sin. Is this philosophy? No, it's politics. People are trying to argue for their version of Judaism. I suspect this is the truth in every religious tradition. We have a saying in Judaism, which I will sell for free to all other religious traditions: 2 Jews, 3 opinions. I think it's true in every religious tradition. You just need a snappy phrase. I don't think it's that different. The other question you asked is worth probably a very long conversation, I think. From the Jewish mystical tradition, and Ed, you know something about this too, God as the host is very complicated, because there's this world and there's all of us. And in the Lurianic Kabbalistic tradition in Judaism, the appearance of a world and people in it is a very carefully and hard-worked act of creativity by God. So God may be the host, but the reality of the day-to-day world is also God. And the reality of the body, and the reality of pleasures, and the reality of sins. All of these are, this is very hard to explain. It's not because it's not permitted, it's just the concepts are hard. Has God created an illusion that God isn't present? Or is God really always present and simply has to be drawn out of the containers of physicality? But the physicality isn't just a container, it's really God. There is a sect, a well-known branch of Judaism, the Chabad Lubavitch sect, which goes so far as to say that if you had the right level of spirituality, you wouldn't see people and tables and chairs. You'd see the words for those things in Hebrew as glowing Hebrew letters, which are the powers that God uses to animate them. We, in our limited ways, see physicality. Really, the world is God's utterances constantly pouring out. So I don't know, where that takes the conversation. It's not that there's a sort of a bare God as the host. There's a fully self-differentiated, self-realized, enfleshed, physicalized God who still isn't equal to those things. We have panentheism in a sort of a rich way. It's not an answer, it's the beginning of a long conversation.
Thank you both for your wonderful talks. And this is preambled by an apology for my ignorance, and that's the whole point of this conference, right? So I don't know to what extent, I don't know anything about the singular and or variety of Jewish experience in history. So my question to you is that you started out with the basics and went on the elaboration from the Western tradition. So I'm wondering, for those people who until a few decades ago, their homes were west of Jerusalem or south of Jerusalem, what would they have, given the different placement, would they have different ideas about hospitality and home, and had they elaborated any such ideas, if you know? I'm just wondering. People from Iraqi background, Jews from Iraqi background, just from Yemeni backgrounds, just from North Africa, had their development tradition or anything to do with hospitality? Sure. And is the experience different? Is it or at a certain point it's different? That's my question.
I'm just going to say that, first of all, ignorance is a very important thing to admit. I am much more learned in the Ashkenazi side of it. What's interesting to me is that the commentator I quoted on the Zohar is himself a Sephardi Jew, means he's in that tradition. And Maimonides, one of the most famous of all the Sephardi Jews, also just states, I looked it up just to make sure I actually was reading the translation right. He actually says that the most important virtue of any kind of hospitality whatsoever is the accompaniment of a guest from the home. And he says if you don't do it, you shouldn't even bother to be hospitable. Now, that doesn't prove anything about the variety of Sephardi traditions of hospitality, and that's why I will now let Ed.
Were you asking about Jews or non-Jews?
All Jews, actually.
I see. Well, I really don't know. All I could say is that recently I was in Paris and had a meal with African friends of mine, and he accompanied me to the metro, even though I wanted to walk around the neighborhood. So I think we can ask the question of my colleague Joseph Lombard, will be talking about hospitality in Arab cultures, and that perhaps is part of, an interesting aspect of your question. How much do Jews and Arabs in the same country or the same culture share in terms of hospitality and other issues?
So, hi. I'm wondering about the connection between land and hospitality. Because we're talking a lot about the history of Jews, and we seem to have a taunting relationship with land. It's promised, and then it's given, and then it's not given, and then you come from Egypt, and you walk for 40 years, and then you cannot come in, and then there's a whole taunting experience there of 2,000 years of diaspora, if I want to bring us to these days, and here comes Israel, which of course makes this a political question too. So, if it is feeling as a stranger that makes us hospitable, what does land do to us? Or does it do anything to us? That's my question.
I have a great way of avoiding your question. That's an important academic trick. Well, I don't implicate my other fellow academics. One of the things that's interesting that I found in researching this talk was that the way this whole question of hospitality is talked about is as a legal matter, which is not at all unusual for the Jewish tradition. There are legal requirements, there are legal limits, there is debate. How much hospitality? How much should a dinner cost? Who do you invite? All the sorts of questions. What's interesting about that is your question, I think rightly, assumes that behind this endless legal conversation is an experience, which I completely agree with you. This is complex. For the Jewish tradition, the legal decisors and formulators of law are taken when they live holy lives to be the mouths through which God's continuing revelation speaks. I have no trouble with the formulation. That doesn't mean that these mouths don't have psyches attached to them and the psyches aren't shaped by their world. So legally, I can completely avoid your question. They don't talk about land at all. They just talk about the virtue of being hospitable. If you're asking, has their experience of exile shaped their interest in hospitality, it would be hard to say no. I would be pressed to go further, but it's hard to say no. There's no question that Israel changes the issue. You could even go so far as to say, I don't think this is a radically new idea, that Jews and Judaism generally don't have a lot of practical political experience. They have a lot of communal organizational experience for 2,000 years. But running a country, it's new. I'm not sure that's much of an answer to your question. Certainly the religious Jews in Israel continue to keep exactly these commandments. They read exactly the same books. I wonder, I'm going to give you the mic in a second. It's a very interesting question. Will these commandments change officially as Israeli decisors, Israeli legal authorities write about them? My guess is probably not, because it's insulated, but the feeling of hospitality may. That's why I ended the way I ended, because it's great to have a country. Having a country, as Derrida points out, brings with it all sorts of complications. I still rather have a country. But you got to be careful, because having a country is a great opportunity to do all sorts of wrong things you could have never imagined being able to do before. So it sticks you in a very complex place. It may be that religion at that point isn't the only language you want to talk. You may need to talk politics.
I'm not sure I understand your question the way you asked it, but I'm reminded of a moment in the Passover Seder where we open the door to welcome Elijah the prophet. For Jews, Elijah the prophet will announce the coming of the Messiah. And the custom, I believe it's not a law, but a custom of opening a door to allow Elijah the prophet to come also reminds us that in certain times in the past it was too dangerous for Jews to open the doors of their house, because there were enemies, anti-Semites, and people who were hostile to Jews who might attack, you see. So the answer to your question is extremely important. The response to your question is extremely important, increasingly. And in order to think about the answers, we have to really look at the context of hospitality and the security or insecurity felt, experienced, or analyzed by Jews in the state of Israel, since that's what we're talking about, and to see how the present conditions of the state of Israel and people who live there, Jews and non-Jews, relate to certain ideals and demands in the religious tradition or in secular traditions, do you see? And so the word politics that Jacob mentioned is a very serious word. We don't take it as a superficial category, but one that links ideals and thoughts to actualities. So I suspect we'll be discussing this for the next couple of days at least. Thank you.
I have a question about the level of unconditionality of hospitality in the way you've developed it. Ed, in one of your passages you mentioned that the strangers, when they come in, also have to observe the same laws as the Jewish people do, and that if they want to offer Passover they have to be circumcised. So there seems to be a certain condition set to this hospitality, and to which extent can you speak of a real recognition of the alterity of the other in Jewish hospitality? And then for Jacob, I was wondering, I was intrigued by your identification, I think, with the worry of Derrida towards Levinas's notion of responsibility and hospitality, but I don't have the feeling that you've resolved it. So I wonder if you could say just a little bit more in terms of what the idea of the worry about the boundaries within Judaism really signifies, or can you say something more about that, whether the worry is that that there are boundaries or that there aren't enough boundaries? I wasn't clear where you stood with that.
Yes, I think that the business of boundaries applies to the question you asked me too, that there are certain conditions. So if you were invited to a Seder and the host, or let's say the head of household, said you can lead the Seder if you get circumcised, assume that you're not circumcised, you'd say, no thank you, you lead the Seder. Okay? So I think that the issue of boundaries is a realistic assessment of what the situation is. And I think that the situation of invitation and guestness is adequate in that particular law. Do you see? So being a guest or a host doesn't mean that you erase otherness. Do you see? And that let's call it the alien nature of the guest is not completely, effaced. So I think that the notion of boundary is a very good one, that being a host and being a guest also means recognizing and respecting boundaries and differences. So now I will pass it to the person of the real différence.
Thank you for that question. I think it connects to your question as well. I don't think I was worrying about boundaries. Maybe this needs to be answered maybe more biographically, not that so much that it will quell the questions, but it will clarify them. Behind this paper, I suppose, is what I happen to do for a living. I'm an unusual sort of academic in many ways, I suppose. I work at a teaching college. I teach adults. Mostly adults, some graduate students, who have chosen to spend their free time acquainting themselves with the rudiments of Jewish tradition. I'd love to tell you this is a great way to get rich. It isn't. It is very meaningful work. It's not particularly religious. Many of these people are minimally religious. Some of them are. It's mostly just so that they know what's going on. There are no texts in Hebrew. It's just mostly in English. I find this work very satisfying. I suppose in that way I identify with people from many cultures, and I've met them. They can be Chinese or Hindus, they can be Muslims, they can be Christians, who discover many people who want to know more about their own way of life and know very little. Perhaps it's a particularly American phenomenon, perhaps it's not. Derrida makes it hard to do that. I don't mean he's against it. I never asked him, I never met him, that's not what I mean. I mean, you can be so vigilant and so worried about asserting and taking pride in and enjoying a way of life, because after all, it could become imperialistic. He's right, it could. I have no answer to that. But that can stop you from embracing your own way of life and seeing in it a richer way to live. And by the way, it can stop you from looking at another person in their way of life, who enjoys their way of life, and saying to them, don't you realize having a way of life is sort of like proto-imperialism? So I guess what you picked up on is, you're right, I'm not resolved. But what I want to be able to do, I suppose more with Levinas than Derrida, and it's a very fine distinction here, is to say, I give you the vigilance. I will never not be vigilant. But I want it to be 51-49. 49 vigilance, 51, I love having a rich culture. I will do the best I can not to read it oppressively. When I encounter difficult texts, I'll do the best I can. But if I'm 67% vigilance, why embrace a way of life? Now there's a state involved. The state has an army. It's a powerful army. It has to be a powerful army. I think Ed's answer was perfect. When the Jews in the Middle East feel they're not in threat of imminent destruction, we'll get further. But it's obviously a two-way street. There are other people who feel imminently in danger of destruction. This is very difficult. I have no wisdom to offer. But I do know that we could say to both groups, don't be so serious about your way of life. Be vigilant. Be Parisian intellectuals and be vigilant. I don't think we get very far. I think we might do better understanding why people identify with their way of life, why they find their own traditions annoying, infuriating, offensive, and full of very rich ideas they've never seen before. So that's really the answer to your question. I'm not sure it's a good enough answer to yours, but that's where the paper came from, is there a way with accepting the vigilance to still be part of a culture, a religious tradition? And thus, when you see others in other religious traditions, to say, I have some sympathy with you. I may not believe the way you do, but I can learn your texts. I can understand why they give you joy. I guess that's the best I can do on that one.
I guess my question comes somewhat in the form of a testimonial, which is to say, in reading Derrida, my experience has always been that he really challenges your imagination, and he challenges not just your imagination in a very kind of he really challenges your ability to read, to actually. Oh yeah. He really it seems as though Derrida really challenges your imagination and your ability to read a text. And somehow, in all of this, I admit, maybe because it's spring in Boston,
stimulating questions and discussion.
Baseball comes to mind. Baseball comes to mind because of Ken Burns' film. And at one point in the film, he's dealing with the issue of race and Jackie Robinson. And it's the first Passover feast, the year that Jackie Robinson became a Major League Baseball player. And he recounts the story of a family in Brooklyn doing the Passover feast and asking the question, what makes this night? I mean, I was reminded of it in your recounting. What makes this night any different than any other night? And the young boy responded by saying not what he should have said. His response was, because tonight Jackie Robinson plays baseball for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And I'm wondering, I'm sorry, but I'm wondering if this is some kind of way in which, without even hosting a stranger, Jackie Robinson was not at dinner, if this is a way of imagining outside of even, the impossibility of hospitality. It just came to mind. So.
That's a historical interpretation of a liberation movement summarized by Jackie Robinson.
And that's a very brilliant insight into the meaning of Passover Seder and of Passover holiday and of the whole, I would call it mythic in the serious sense of the term, story of the Israelites up to the present day. It's wonderful. Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks. I just wondered if either of you had anything more to say about gers, about resident aliens, either Jews as resident aliens in Christian culture, or what that model could mean in Israel, or anything.
So as not to avoid controversy, there's an Israeli politician whose name I could probably remember, but I'm not going to mention the name, who has suggested that Arab citizens leave Israel. This is exactly the opposite of what I believe and what the majority of Jews and Israelis believe at the present time. And so this type of noxious hatred and racism is what Jews have experienced historically over the centuries, and for that precise reason we are hopefully adequately inoculated against it. But when these inner conflicts arise, we have to evoke the deeper laws of hospitality and say that these citizens are citizens, and if there are differences between Israeli Arab citizens and Israeli Jewish citizens, then we have a problem. And so, we're working on it. But the conference here, I think, will help us all.
One last question, please.
Thanks, guys, for coming. Both of you, in speaking, helped me, who's not a Jew, understand that hospitality exists in time, and it's a transformative experience. It's part of the memory of a people, of going through one experience and one way of living as exiles, as being without homes, without a land of one's own, into that change aspect. And then hospitality is kind of a way of remembering who you were and who you still are. And almost that being in exile is, for a Jew, perhaps inherent to his Jewishness. What I want to ask you, though, is assuming that, as both of you have said, that to be hospitable means to have a home, to give. What about all of us in our literal and figurative ways without homes? How is hospitality possible in that very Jewish notion? How do we host? How do we continue this experience or learn from it? Is it possible without a home?
Well, the sukkah is a fragile room-like booth, and the main characteristic of it is fragility and impermanence. And so paradoxically, it's a home that's not a home, because it's not permanent. I would not in any way romanticize the life of homeless people, or to turn it into a metaphor. Okay? But I think that the whole issue of hospitality, and that we were strangers in a strange land, reminds us, let's say as Jews, that one never has a perfect home. Home is never absolute. And so when I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, so as not to talk about it, the establishment of the State of Israel, we are still waiting for Israel to become Israel, though we are devoted to the state of Israel as it exists. Do you know what I mean? And so the ideals that we're striving for are really on the way, and Israel is Israel, and the diaspora is a diaspora. You know, so being in exile is also being accompanied by God in exile, according to Heschel's interpretation of the Kabbalah. You see, so we're finding all kinds of ways to live through paradoxes that can't be, and contradictions that can't be resolved logically, but we're trying to resolve them, or at least to deal with them progressively, and that's about all we can ask of ourselves in the end.
There's, again, this is a very rich question, and I'm worried about answering it too glibly because you don't want to sort of underwrite the virtuousness of homelessness, right? I'm just thinking, Levinas uses a lot of metaphors about the way that a human being is, in a certain way, a container for another human being. Levinas uses these amazing metaphors: rips out your core, occupies you, possesses you. All of this is to describe the ethical. Again, I hear Ed here. You don't want to say, therefore, that metaphorically Levinas is suggesting you don't need a home. You can just be a home for others. On the other hand, it is possible also to, in certain ways, make others feel at home if you have that capacity, even if you don't have a home. I guess you could call it on the way to a kind of full hospitality, something like that. And I suppose, just one last comment, the Levinas, Derrida, and then their critics following, their argument about Zionism is very, very interesting, because Levinas says what you just said. He said, is Israel perfect now? No. But I know, he says, I don't know how, he says, I know that when Jews finally will make the state they're supposed to make, it will be run by principles of justice. So he also feels this on-the-way business. It's like Jews don't have a lot of experience in this line of work. And they found it very difficult after about 2,000 years to go it without a home. So they're trying to build a home. There are people who don't want them to be there, people who want them to be there if they are perceived to be better. And then, as you say, there are internal people inside the state who have very unusual ideas about what a democratic country looks like. I think it's in process. Many of us were absolutely outraged at the idea that Arab citizens of Israel would not be counted as citizens, maybe in their opinions. So do American citizens. That's not news. That seems to be not a compromisable issue for most Jews, except very extreme ones. That's only one small piece of the solution. But if you think of it as, in the scale of Jewish time, a state that's been around for 60 years is nothing compared to 2 millennia. So maybe that's a kind of hopeful improvement, I suppose.